So let me begin by asking you about the definition of sex, which we all are born and brought up to, listen, and we consistently are being fed with, like it's penile vaginal intercourse. That is considered to be the de facto definition of sex. How much does this definition change as you enter midlife, especially for women?
I don't think that it's about it changing necessarily. I think that it's more that we perhaps get more confident as we become more sexually experienced and we start to explore in different ways. And, often what we're seeing is people in that kind of more midlife section of their lives also are in relationships where it's quite well established, if they're in a long-term relationship, and they feel more able to kind of be a bit flexible with what it is that they've been doing. But this definition of sex being so limited to penis and vagina penetration, to intercourse, trips so many people up, causes so many challenges for people sexually, because it makes us feel when we're doing anything else that's outside of that it's not, the real thing. And we even see this in the language we have. So, for example, the word foreplay indicates that what we do in that time is something we do before something else, rather than that it's valid in itself. Yeah. And that's something that I often challenge with people that I'm working with, kind of whatever phase or stage of their life they're at, because it's important that we validate all these expressions of sex, of desire, of wanting, of pleasure. And one of the things I think we get so hooked up on is this idea that we're doing something a way that we should be. And actually that can explain a lot of the time why so many people are dissatisfied with the sex that they're having.
So when you enter midlife, especially for a woman, what is the kind of changes which she can expect in terms of sexuality, in terms of what is this kind of surprises which she might expect? Can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, I always talk about sex as approaching sex with a biopsychosocial approach. So this is everything that I kind of write about in my book and I talk about, and all the discussions I have are, we cannot understand sex in terms of just the physical, just the emotional, or just the social. We have to look at all three, and the combination, the kind of the relationship between all three constantly is interrelating to each other. And so at every phase and stage of life, we understand that sex is in context. So everything that we have going on in our lives, whether that be physical, social, psychological, emotional, can impact sex, and sex can impact all of those things. And that is something that every different kind of phase or stage of our lives will present different strengths, weaknesses, kind of difficulties, challenges, things that feel easier for us. When we're getting to that kind of midlife window, if we're talking about physically, we're talking in the average age for kind of going into menopause is around kind of 45 to like 52, that kind of bracket. And what we're doing is we're thinking about, okay, so what are the physical changes that are going on for someone? So they might be experiencing that kind of slower decline of estrogen. And when we're talking about perimenopause, it's not just one day that it kind of starts and it happens. It's a process that can go on for a long time, and it's not a sudden change. It's a gradual change.
Sorry.
I think, I don't know the exact number, but I think it sometimes can be, like over a period of like a couple of years. And it's obviously dependent. Lots of people might start menopause earlier, later. It's dependent on things. For example, we see some people pushed into medical menopause or induced menopause because of cancer or cancer treatment, or because they have like challenges with their ovaries, or kind of very difficult periods, things like that. And so there might be different reasons that people are going into it. But when we're talking about, kind of non-medicalized, or kind of the natural process of menopause, it is this gradual decline. And we might not realize that some of the symptoms that we're experiencing are to do with that. So, for example, brain fog, or disruption to our sleep, or changes to our mood, vaginal dryness, which can make sex feel painful. And so this is why we see this kind of, a minimum of 32 common symptoms of menopause, and then many, many beyond that. And they are psychological, physical, and then there's a social element as well. And all of those things affect how we see ourselves, how we feel about ourselves. And when it comes to sex, that has then that kind of two-way relationship between how I feel about myself outside of sex is also going to impact how I feel about myself in sex. And so we have to look at it with this broad lens.
So basically, you cannot say that menopause can lead to a reduction or decrease in sex interest in sex for women, or can increase for some women. It can also increase. How is that? Is there any studies or research on that aspect when it comes to sexuality for women?
Well, it's like different stages of the menstrual cycle. We see that there's kind of evidence for kind of peaks and drops in all different aspects. And there's lots of research that shows lots of different things. It might be, for example, that someone in midlife is in a new relationship, experiencing great sex with a new partner. They're feeling like sex is exciting again, or they're exploring sexuality. And that could coincide with that part of their lives. And that might not have such an effect. Whereas we might find that someone who has been struggling with sex for a long time, or has been finding sex unpleasurable, might find that those symptoms are meeting them at that point. And that could be a completely different thing. And so what we see is that sex might change and desire might change, and that's going to be dependent on the factors. So if we're in a relationship for a long time, we typically see that desire is something that happens more responsively rather than spontaneously. So we are more used to that person. We might have more routines, more habits, and we might notice that that's something that needs a bit of assistance if we're experiencing something like vaginal dryness due to the discomfort that we feel because of the estrogen depletion or the estrogen drop. That could be a simple thing we could do to change it. Might be using lubrication or using a really good quality water-based lubricant. That could be the thing that changes that experience or makes it feel comfortable. But if we are someone who doesn't feel we're able to do that or doesn't know about that, we could continue having sex which is feeling uncomfortable for us and painful for us, and that's going to be a demotivating factor for sex. That's not going to make us want to do that more, and we see the knock-on effect on desire. And that's why we're constantly, you'll hear me say this a lot, looking at things with this wide view, this wide lens, and these kind of relationships between all these different aspects of our lives. Because if we're experiencing painful or uncomfortable sex, we can't communicate with our partner about that, and we start to think, okay, what's wrong with me? The problem must be to do with me. That's going to make us feel bad, create a cycle of, shame or guilt or embarrassment. And again, those are not things that make us feel good sexually.
Yeah, you talked about painful sex. I have read reports saying that women in midlife, when they go through the perimenopause and menopausal phase, they prefer to have oral sex instead of penile vaginal intercourse. Is that true?
Well, when we talk about, if it's to do with painful sex, often when we're talking about painful sex, it's to do with penetrative sex or it's to do with intercourse. So we have some kind of data and some kind of research around the fact that some people have kind of vulval pain conditions where it might be kind of painful with clitoral touch or with vulval touch. But if we're talking, when we kind of think about this idea of painful sex, the assumption is that sex is penetrative sex. And so when we look at, for example, conditions like vaginismus, which is the involuntary contraction of the pelvic floor muscles, which makes penetration difficult or uncomfortable or impossible, then if someone is able to build comfort around kind of touch externally and clitoral touch and, inviting a partner into that if they wish, then that doesn't mean they don't have a sex life. It means that they can enjoy all of those things which are pleasurable and do feel good for them, whilst they either decide to not do the other part or to continue to work on the other part. And that's where, again, we get back to that initial discussion, which is about the definition of sex. And so, yes, other types of sex. If something is painful sex is common, that doesn't mean it's normal. And what we shouldn't be doing is continuing to have sex that doesn't feel good for us or continuing to have sex which feels painful for us. And we can adapt our sex lives to find other ways of experiencing pleasure and enjoyment. And that might be changing the way that you have sex or changing what you're doing when it comes to having sex. Yeah,
basically experimenting a lot more and broadening the definition of sex which you have understood till that time. Also, maybe
absolutely.
A vibrator as a part of the... Yeah. Do you think that there is a drastic dip or decline in libido happening, especially for women than men during midlife?
We see it reported declining, particularly kind of across aging and also particularly in long-term relationships. But again, sometimes we find people discovering themselves sexually in midlife. And when we talk about arousal and desire, so we have desire, which is the want, the motivation, the kind of psychological interest of sex, and arousal being the physical process of the body and the brain preparing for sex. Now, whilst someone might be struggling with, for example, let's pick something we've talked about so far, vaginal dryness, which might make sex painful or uncomfortable or a little bit more difficult. If we were to combat that with something like good education around why it's happening and a good water-based lubricant, that could alleviate the physical symptoms, and the desire and the wanting and the interest might still very much be there. And so then what we're seeing is these two things are much more in line than perhaps they were before. And then for some people, what we see is that they physically might be fine, but they might be having a reduced interest around sex. And that could be because of how they feel about their bodies, how they feel about their relationship, their connection to themselves, because they have so much going on, because they're working and looking after children and running a house and have a job and have a million things to do, and sex doesn't feel like a priority. And that kind of lack of interest of sex might also be, I don't have the time to kind of switch out of the headspace of everything I'm doing to make time and space for sex. And that's something we see a lot, particularly where we have couples who are both working, parenting, doing a lot, have really busy lives. Technology plays a huge role in our lives. Often couples are both in bed together, both on their phones, not really kind of paying attention to each other. And so we see these kind of lifestyle barriers as well that also kind of play a big role. And we typically see that sex happens more regularly at the start of relationships and does tend to kind of decline. Whether that's in line with aging, obviously depends on kind of the length of the relationship. But we are noticing that there are definitely trends for sure. But you also see people who are dating in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s who are reporting having great sex.
Yeah. So basically, having a new partner can revive your sex life even at 60.
Well, also, or changing something with an old partner. Often what happens is people get stuck, and the kind of thing that we see that is most kind of predictable of couples reporting sexual satisfaction is them prioritizing their sex life, making an effort with their sex life.
Scheduling sex.
And basically I talk about giving sex intentional attention. And something that I talk about is how we arrange everything else. We book our gym classes, we call our parents, we make dinner reservations with our friends, we kind of make plans with our kids. And we suddenly expect that sex is the one part of our life that is protected from us not paying attention to it.
True.
And that's irrespective of any phase or stage. But what we might have to do for our sex life might change dependent. What we do for our sex life in our 20s might be different to our 40s, to our 60s. And adapting dependent on what we have going on is one of the most important kind of critical factors for me of sexual wellness, which is, okay, that isn't working for me anymore. How can I find what is working for me now?
Okay.
And I think that's the thing that so many of us feel like we don't know how to do.
True. Also, Kate, for women especially, when they are, as from a very young age, they are taught to look at sex as something which they engage in only for reproduction. Okay, and can this kind of an outlook really hamper their outlook on sexuality when they go through menopause and perimenopause phase, where they stop seeking out real help for sexual difficulties because they think that it's over for them because since it is the end of reproductive stage?
Yeah, well, we see a big gap in people seeking out medical advice for problems to do with their genitals or to do with sex anyway. So we see that there's often a delay in people seeking out those appointments, and because of embarrassment or because it's to do with sex. And so I'd absolutely encourage you, if you are struggling with sex, you are experiencing symptoms or you notice any bodily changes, to absolutely go and see your medical professional. But it's, this whole conversation around reproduction, particularly the sex education that we've seen over here in the UK has been very reproduction focused the whole time.
In India also. There is something like that.
Yeah. And so finally, we're starting to have conversations around consent and relationships and pleasure. But it feels like all of the focus has been around that for a very long time. And what we have to do is to start kind of pulling back from that and redesigning it in terms of, okay, and this is also about knowing your normal. And we have a lot of ideas about what normal is.
Correct.
And actually we should know our normal. And we have a great organization here in the UK called the Eve Appeal, who have done a lot of work on...
Can you spell it?
The Eve Appeal,
Eve Appeal. Okay, EV. Okay.
Yeah. And they are a gynecological cancers charity, but a huge part of their work has been about, don't think about normal as this big term, know your normal, and then you will know if anything changes. And it's a really important message, because if we think, okay, well, I'm kind of perimenopausal now, and we can still get pregnant in perimenopause. It is still possible. But when we're menopausal, and we're starting to think, okay, well, that's me, that's me down, or that's my kind of body not doing what I needed to anymore, we're discounting a huge part of what that body part is for, a huge part of our relationship to our whole body and to our pleasure and to our connection with ourselves. And it's important because we have, a huge part of our lives ahead of us at that point to enjoy in a different way and experience in a different way.
Absolutely. And also, even talking about reproduction, you talk only about vagina. There is absolutely no mention about vulva. And I think people often confuse vagina with vulva, right?
Yes.
So that is the big misnomer. How do you address, is it sex education the only way in which you can do it? Or, at that stage, how can you actually help women who go through this menopausal phase in, guiding them to seek help? Tell them that this is normal. This is something which all women go through, instead of feeling embarrassed, ashamed about their situation.
Yeah, I think that education and kind of normalized conversations is the biggest part of it. I think someone like the Eve Appeal have brilliant resources. I think there are now so many podcasts about this part of our life and books, and it's fantastic and very needed, because even though it's such a normal part of life and womanhood, there's always been a conversation which has been kind of hidden, and we've been pretending hasn't been happening for people. And it can have such big impact on people's lives, physically, emotionally, socially. And I think that giving yourself permission to kind of understand yourself a bit better is the first bit, but also equipping yourself with the knowledge. So if you feel like you haven't got it, go and get it, because I think that's, one of the things I talk about in a big way is sex education across the lifetime, because so many of us feel like we didn't start our sexual and intimate lives with the education we wanted. But like you're saying there, people using the terms vulva and vagina interchangeably and again, to quote the Eve Appeal, they found a few years ago that a piece of research that 40% of women couldn't correctly label parts of the female anatomy on a diagram. And we're thinking, okay, well then how can I identify something that's changed in my body if I don't know how to correctly name my body parts? And that's just, that's the kind of, I guess, drip feeding conversation, which is, okay, we're starting to change it. And the more people say it correctly, the more people kind of find out. And we are changing that. But the vagina is the internal elastic canal from the neck of the womb, the cervix, down to the labia, to the entrance of the vagina. And the vulva is the entire external of the genitals. And it's important that we know, and again, it's a part of knowing our normal, but it's important that we know the correct names for our bodies, because they're our bodies and we should feel in charge of them in that way.
Correct.